The freezing Chicago wind cuts straight through your jacket in December, especially around midnight in an open asphalt parking lot behind a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city. I was standing there after finishing my second shift of the day, watching my breath vanish into the icy air, my feet completely numb inside cheap slip-resistant work shoes. Porch. Right then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an iMessage from my dad. A few tired strands of Christmas lights blinked on a brick wall nearby, but the only thing running through my mind was how many hours of sleep I could squeeze in before clocking in at my full-time day job. My dad's text sounded upbeat, almost excited. Porch. He told me to come home to Naperville early for Christmas because they had set up a massive surprise. I remember smiling a little. Deep down, I still wanted to believe that everything I was doing, the relentless double shifts, the cold sandwiches eaten in my car, and that bone-deep exhaustion, was all for warm family moments like that. Porch. I hit the unlock button on my beat-up Honda Civic, and my phone buzzed a second time. It was an Instagram notification. With stiff fingers, I tapped the screen. It was a photo of my younger sister, Chloe. She was standing in the driveway of our parents' suburban home, leaning against the hood of a brand-new, bright red Ferrari, beaming with absolute pride. Porch. It was the kind of luxury supercar you only expect to see on the cover of an automotive magazine or behind velvet ropes in Beverly Hills. My chest tightened instantly, and my heart missed a beat. Porch. My mind started racing through the numbers I knew by heart. The rent on my tiny Wicker Park apartment, my car insurance, the automatic monthly Zelle transfers I set up to cover Chloe's student loans, and every unexpected shortfall my dad asked me to cover whenever property taxes went up. For years, I had been sending money into the family account without missing a single month. Porch. In that exact second, it hit me that I hadn't been treated like a daughter in a very long time. I was just a walking ATM. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, staring at the screen until it went dark. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by a flickering streetlight, with a couple of abandoned shopping carts rattling in the wind. Porch. I should have driven straight back to my apartment, taken a hot shower, and gone to bed. But my hands were shaking too hard to put the key into the ignition. In that photo, Chloe looked radiant, like everything in the world naturally belonged to her. My dad was standing right at the edge of the frame, his shoulder barely visible, but I recognized him immediately. Porch. Whenever something major happened in Chloe's life, he was always right there by her side. What hurt the most was not just the car worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was how completely normal it felt to them. Porch. While I stood in a break room between shifts counting quarters just to decide between a snack and an extra cup of black coffee, her receiving an extravagant gift like that was treated as perfectly reasonable. I tried making excuses for them in my head. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe none of it came from my money. Porch. Maybe my dad took out a loan against his retirement fund. Or maybe it was a stroke of luck. But my gut already knew the truth. A quiet voice I had ignored for years whispered in my ear that I knew exactly where those funds came from. I leaned my forehead against the cold steering wheel, feeling the cumulative weight of this year and the past decade pressing down on me. Porch. My dad's favorite line echoed in my head, the phrase he always used whenever he needed help. "Sarah, you are the strongest and most independent one in this family, so you understand, right?" I was 30 years old. I had moved to the city on my own, renting a unit in an older walk-up building, because I believed that independence was something to be proud of. Porch. By day, I worked a full-time logistics job, the kind of respectable white-collar career you talk about around the Thanksgiving dinner table. By night, I put on a diner uniform smelling of grease and carried trays until my legs trembled, keeping a polite smile plastered on my face. I did not work myself into the ground because I loved the hustle. Porch. I did it because in my family, being the responsible one was never a choice. Somewhere along the way, responsibility stopped being a phase of my life and turned into my entire identity. Whenever friends or coworkers found out I worked 2 jobs, they would praise me, calling me superwoman. They treated it like a compliment, as if that level of endurance came with no personal cost. Orch. They never saw me eating cold leftovers in a freezing car with a plastic fork. They never saw me sitting at my desk at the end of the month, stressed over which credit card payment could wait another week. And they never saw the monthly transfers I sent through my banking app, labeled as family support or emergency funds, as if polite labels could disguise being drained. Orch. I never admitted to myself that I was being taken advantage of. I just kept believing I was doing the right thing. My dad had a way of asking for support without ever sounding demanding. It usually started with a Sunday evening phone call. Orch. His voice would carry a heavy tone of worry as he talked about inflation, rising property taxes in Illinois, or an unexpected furnace repair bill that cost a fortune. He never came right out and demanded money. He did not have to. He just shared his stress, leaving the silence hanging until my guilt pushed me to step in. Orch. Then he would tell me how grateful he was, how proud he felt, and how lucky the family was to have a daughter who was doing so well in Chicago. Every time I confirmed a transfer, it felt temporary, like a short-term push, just to get everyone through a rough patch until things stabilized. My sister Chloe never had to weather those rough patches. She was 5 years younger, softer, and more emotional. According to the family, she was still finding herself. Whenever she struggled to find work after college, hopped between unpaid internships, or quit due to stress, everyone treated it as a delicate phase that needed gentle care. When I faced the exact same pressures, it was taken as proof that I could handle even more. Nobody ever spoke that double standard out loud, but it ran through every family interaction. My job was to cover the expenses, while her job was to follow her dreams. I handled the harsh realities, and she was given room to breathe. Sitting in that dark parking lot, I thought about all the moments I pushed through sheer exhaustion just because I thought it served a purpose. I remembered showing up late to holiday dinners after overtime shifts, apologizing before I could even sit down for a warm plate. I remembered how often they told me that I did not need much, as if my personal needs were always optional. That picture of the sports car burned in my mind. Suddenly, all the small details from the past years aligned, revealing a reality I could no longer ignore. I finally turned the key, pulled out, and headed toward my apartment. Interstate 90 was quiet late at night. The radio played upbeat holiday tracks about joy and togetherness, but right then, they felt completely disconnected from my reality. On the drive home, I tried to talk myself down. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that family relationships should not be measured like business transactions, and that I was probably overreacting. I had repeated those lines so many times over the years that they sounded like an automatic script. When I pulled into the parking garage and shut off the engine, the silence felt heavier. I sat there looking through the windshield, replaying my dad's message alongside the photo of that luxury car. The truth was uncomfortable, which was why I had avoided looking at it for so long. I liked feeling needed. I liked believing that my efforts kept our family secure. Without that role, I was not even sure who I was supposed to be. Inside the apartment, I dropped my bag by the door and sank onto the couch in the dark. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cold coffee. This was the space I paid for and maintained entirely on my own, yet it felt like a temporary stop between endless obligations. I pulled out my phone one last time and opened the photo. The comments were full of congratulations and supportive messages. Nobody asked where the money came from. Nobody ever did. I pictured Christmas morning, driving out to the suburbs, walking into the living room, and having everyone look at me, waiting to see my reaction to the car. I pictured myself putting on a supportive smile, hugging my sister, and pretending that nothing felt wrong. That had always been my role, smoothing over the rough edges so everyone else could live comfortably. Sitting there in the dark, I had to wonder when I started believing that wanting an easier life for myself was something wrong. That feeling of being invisible had not started tonight. It was built up over years of quiet obligations and cheap praise that only arrived when I gave more. The sports car was simply the first thing large enough and bright enough to completely shatter the story I had been telling myself. I barely slept that night. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the occasional snowplow pass by outside, realizing that Christmas was right around the corner and my family had never felt further away. I still did not know what my next step would be, and part of me still hoped there was a reasonable explanation. But deep down, something fundamental had shifted. I had seen the reality clearly, and I could not unsee it. For the first time in years, a real question took root. What happens if I stop being the strong, accommodating daughter who absorbs everything? I stayed in my car that night far longer than necessary. Sitting in the cold was easier than walking upstairs and facing the situation head-on. Pretending this was just exhaustion or an overreaction felt safer than admitting the truth. As the freezing Chicago chill seeped through the windows, the core issue became undeniable. When did supporting my family stop being a helpful gesture and turn into an expected debt? It had not happened overnight. There was no single dramatic moment where everything changed. It crept in gradually, framed as loyalty and mutual support. At first, I felt proud. Knowing they turned to me during tough times made me feel valued. I wore that role like a badge of honor without questioning what it was taking from me. Years ago, before I took on the diner shifts, my dad called on a weekday evening. His voice sounded worn out, explaining that things were tight, with unexpected medical deductibles, and that he just needed a small hand until cash flow improved. He did not demand anything. He simply laid out the difficulty and let the silence sit until my conscience made me offer to cover it. I agreed immediately, reassuring him that it was no problem and that I had the savings to handle it. When we hung up, I felt helpful, reliable, and appreciated. That first transfer felt like a bridge. I told myself that was how families functioned, stepping up when someone stumbled. It did not feel like a burden because my regular job paid reasonably well, and knowing my money eased their stress made me feel connected to them despite the physical distance. Those calls never stopped. The reasons just kept changing. One month it was an urgent roof repair. The next, an increase in home insurance premiums. Later, it was extra tuition costs when Chloe switched her degree track, which was presented as an investment in her future. Each time, the dollar amount grew and the urgency sounded greater. Each time I said yes, because saying no felt like failing the standard I had set for myself. That was when I picked up the night shifts at the diner. I told myself it was temporary, just until things stabilized back home. During my initial training, when coworkers joked about side hustles, I laughed along as if it were an exciting project. In reality, it was draining. My days turned into a blur of early alarms, crowded train commutes, and aching feet. I ran on large coffees and sheer determination, learning to keep smiling at customers even when my body wanted to quit. Most mornings, my alarm went off before sunrise. I would lie there for a few seconds gathering the energy to get out of bed, moving as efficiently as possible to conserve stamina. Breakfast was toast on the run, and lunch was cold food eaten at my desk or in the car between jobs. By the time my evening shift started, I was completely worn out, but I pushed through because there was always another bill, another transfer, and another reason why I could not slow down. I told myself this was what being a responsible adult looked like. When my dad called to thank me, his warm, appreciative tone was the reassurance I leaned on to feel I was doing the right thing. He always closed those conversations by saying how proud he was and how lucky the family was to have me. Those words meant more to me than my actual bank balance. The one thing I avoided doing was keeping a strict record. I never added up all the transfers, and I never asked when the money would be returned. I used soft labels on every transaction note, like a little help or family support, just to soften the reality of how much was leaving my account. Treating financial support to my own parents like a ledger felt uncomfortable, so whenever a quiet doubt surfaced, I reminded myself that real families do not keep score. Meanwhile, Chloe moved through her 20s with total flexibility. She changed jobs frequently, went on travel retreats to find herself, and paused her studies whenever she felt overwhelmed. Whenever she hit a roadblock, the family treated it with patience and protective care. Nobody worried about me that way. They simply assumed I was fine because I always handled things. I vividly remember one phone call after working 14 hours straight. I was standing in the freezing wind at a gas station, my legs trembling from exhaustion, while my dad casually mentioned that Chloe was thinking about changing her graduate school plans, which might involve extra expenses for a while. I stayed quiet, mentally calculating how many extra diner shifts I would need to pick up. Before I could say a word, my dad added that I was always great at figuring these things out. It was not a question, it was an assumption. Somehow, that felt heavier than a direct request for money. There were days when the pressure felt suffocating, and I had to pull over just to catch my breath. There were nights when I sat on the edge of my bed, without enough energy to take off my shoes. I skipped friends' birthdays and weekend getaways, smiling along while coworkers talked about their trips, already calculating my upcoming schedule. Every decision I made was filtered through a single question: how much money could I send home this month? Even then, I did not see myself as someone being mistreated. I saw myself as the dependable one who did not need saving. There was a strange comfort in that role, because feeling needed felt safer than acknowledging how isolated I really was. The money never came back, not a single dollar. No one explicitly said it was a gift, but the word temporary was used so often that I assumed repayment was understood. I never tracked when temporary quietly turned into permanent. Whenever I considered asking about it, guilt stopped me. So I kept quiet, worked harder, tightened my budget, and told myself I could rest later. When Chloe talked about her upcoming plans and trips, I listened and smiled, because that was easier than addressing the imbalance. Seeing that photo of the car brought all those buried memories back at once. Every late night, every skipped meal to save money, every transfer sent without hesitation. It struck me how long it had been since anyone genuinely asked how I was doing beneath the surface. I thought about the upcoming holiday gathering, driving out to that large suburban house, and sliding back into my usual role as the dependable older daughter who keeps everything running smoothly. I used to believe that if I kept working hard and giving support, things would eventually balance out. Walking up to my apartment door in the cold, a different realization settled in. The situation never felt balanced because it was never designed to be. The hardest part was not just how much I had given, but the clear realization that there had never been a plan to make things right. I did not start questioning this dynamic out of resentment. I started questioning it because my physical limits forced me to slow down, and in that stillness, patterns I had overlooked for years became impossible to ignore. Favoritism does not always show up through open conflict. Often, it hides behind polite words, gentle concern, and the appearance of care. In my family, it had a very familiar routine. Growing up, Chloe and I were treated differently, but there was always a reason. She was the younger, sensitive child who needed extra attention, while I was capable, independent, and needed less oversight. When she was upset, people rushed to comfort her. When I struggled, I was expected to figure it out on my own. Back then, that division seemed normal. Someone had to be steady, and I learned early on that it had to be me. That dynamic carried right into adulthood. When Chloe made mistakes, she received understanding. When I made a mistake, it was treated as a personal lapse I needed to manage myself. If she shifted career paths, it was personal growth. If I showed self-doubt, it was unnecessary worry. Porch. I never resented her. I cared about my sister, but I could not ignore that her comfort was funded by my stability. At a family dinner not long ago, Chloe was talking about how stressed she felt with her routine. My dad leaned in with genuine concern, asking what she needed, and how the family could make things easier for her. Porch. When the conversation turned to me, he smiled and remarked that I always had everything completely under control, so he never had to worry about me. Everyone smiled as if it were a high compliment, and I smiled along, even though something sank inside me. The phrase stayed with me. Porch. It sounded affectionate, but underneath was an unspoken rule. Because I was dependable, my needs did not require attention. The more reliable I became, the less anyone wondered if I needed support in return. Once finances entered the picture, that imbalance became stark. Chloe never had to think about how bills were paid or where the funds originated. Porch. She was shielded from financial pressure, while my contributions were treated as a standard continuous resource. No one asked how hard it was or what I gave up to make it happen. Whenever I tried to drop subtle hints about being exhausted after long shifts, the responses were always predictable. Porch. They told me I was naturally driven, held myself to high standards, or that working those hours was simply my own choice. The implication was clear. If I was worn down, it was my own doing, which made it impossible to ask for relief without feeling ungrateful. No one ever told Chloe her difficulties were just her own choice. Porch. Her setbacks were treated as outside circumstances that required family backing. Watching that contrast repeat itself, I tried to convince myself it did not matter, but each time I brushed it aside, a small part of me pulled away. My concerns were consistently minimized, not out of malice, but out of habit. If I mentioned wanting time off, I was reminded how fortunate I was to have work. Porch. If I mentioned stress, it was framed as healthy ambition. One afternoon, after a brutal shift, I called my dad just to hear a familiar voice, not asking for anything. The conversation quickly shifted to Chloe, her ideas, and her upcoming plans. Porch. When I mentioned in passing how tired I was lately, there was a brief pause on the line before he simply said I had always been good at handling a heavy load. The call ended shortly after, leaving me with a hollow feeling, realizing that being the responsible one meant I was expected to provide support, never receive it. Porch. I tried telling myself this was not favoritism, that it was just differences in personality. But looking back, the pattern was clear. Whenever resources were available, they went toward Chloe, and whenever sacrifices were needed, they landed on me. Porch. What hurt most was not that Chloe received help, but that my efforts were treated as invisible, as though my capacity to give had no personal cost attached to it. I started wondering what would happen if I stepped back. Would anyone notice my absence, or would they only notice that the financial cushion was gone? Porch. I disliked where those thoughts led, so I pushed them aside, feeling guilty for even considering them. But moments kept breaking through, like when Chloe casually mentioned purchasing an expensive designer item in a family chat, as if it were nothing. I knew where the household funds came from, and I knew she had not earned them herself. Porch. I did not feel anger right away, just a deep, lingering fatigue. My family had framed my financial help as my personal decision, neatly removing any sense of obligation on their end. If it was simply my choice, they did not have to feel responsible for the toll it took on me. Lying in bed at night, imagining a life where I was not carrying everyone else, felt completely unfamiliar. Porch. The thought of stepping away from that identity was intimidating, even more than the exhaustion of working 2 jobs. The photo of that red sports car was no longer just an update. It had become a clear symbol of years of quiet imbalances, heavy assumptions, and how conditional their care had really been. I was not ready for a confrontation, and I was not ready to lay everything out publicly. Porch. But the fundamental trust was broken, and once that happens, you cannot simply glue it back together. For the first time, I let myself accept a hard reality. Being dependable should never mean being ignored, and true family support does not require one person to completely deplete themselves. Orch. I was not sure what my next step would be, but I understood one thing clearly. The difference between who gets protected and who gets expected to pay had been drawn a long time ago, and I had been standing on the wrong side of that line. That evening, I did not sit down at my computer to build a case against anyone. I sat down simply because the exhaustion had become too heavy to carry without understanding why. It was a quiet Tuesday night. I came home from my second job, kicked off my work shoes by the door, and stood in the kitchen, my hands still unsteady from physical fatigue. I opened my laptop, telling myself I just wanted to look over the numbers to make sure stress was not distorting my perception. I logged into my online banking portal and pulled up my transfer records. At first, I did not even scroll down. I looked at the most recent entry. The same amount, the same recipient account, and the same familiar sense of obligation that had repeated month after month. I leaned back, took a breath, and told myself to stay level-headed. Then, I started scrolling back through the statements. The transactions kept appearing, month after month, year after year, showing a steady outflow that I had never fully totaled in one place. My focus had always been tied up in managing the immediate bills and upcoming shifts. Seeing the entire history laid out in black and white made the reality undeniable. I began adding the amounts up slowly, reading through the transaction notes one by one. Rent help, Chloe's tuition, insurance coverage, emergency bridge, just this once. The final number on my screen was so much higher than I had imagined. It was so high that my mind simply refused to process it at first. Halfway through the calculation, I stopped, closed my eyes, and felt my stomach twist into a knot. I was not even angry yet. I was just deeply stunned. This was not a handful of spare dollars scraped together here and there, nor was it just a couple of tight months. It was an endless drain, an unspoken agreement that everyone relied on without ever naming it out loud. I remembered every single phone call tied to those numbers. My dad's voice was always calm, wrapped in a quiet sense of urgency, explaining why things were falling short again that month. He always framed it as a temporary rough patch, something we would all look back on and laugh about once it was over. Just until we get back on our feet, Sarah, he would always say. And every single time, I believed him. Or rather, I desperately wanted to believe him. The comforting illusion that my sacrifices were keeping the family afloat was the only thing giving purpose to my exhausting routine. Staring at the glowing monitor, a harsh truth hit me. There was never an end date. Not once had anyone said, "This is the last time." Temporary had quietly turned into permanent, and I was never even invited into the conversation. I had simply absorbed the burden like a sponge. I kept scrolling all the way back to the very first transaction. I could still clearly picture where I was when I sent it, sitting on the worn-out couch in my old apartment, filled with pride that I could step up for my family. Back then, I was completely certain I was doing the right thing. Looking at that first record now, I felt a painful ache for the person I used to be, the one who genuinely thought it was just a short-term crisis. My phone suddenly vibrated on the counter, making me flinch. For a split second, my pulse raced, as if someone could look through the screen and catch what I was doing. It was just a text from my dad asking how work was going, ending with a simple smiley face. I stared at the message for a long time before typing out a brief reply. Busy, but okay. It was the truth, the kind of standard non-committal answer that never invited follow-up questions or concern. I came close to shutting my laptop right then. I almost convinced myself that I had seen enough. But something held me there, my hand resting on the trackpad, my eyes glued to those cold figures. I scrolled down to the most recent statements, the exact months when my shifts at the diner increased, and my own personal savings completely flatlined. A chilling realization settled heavily on my chest. I was not offering a helping hand. I was funding an entire lifestyle. The next day, that reality followed me everywhere. At my desk at the logistics company with unread emails piling up, and behind the register at the diner smiling at customers, those figures kept looping in my head. It was no longer guilt, it was an unsettling clarity. For the first time, instead of wondering how to earn that money back, I started asking myself what all of this really meant. That evening I called my dad. Not to confront him or demand answers. I told myself I just wanted to check in. He answered warmly, sounding relaxed. We started with casual small talk about the bad Chicago weather and his weekend golf plans. In the background, I could hear Chloe laughing without a care in the world. When a pause opened up in the conversation, I took a breath and casually asked about a specific bill I had covered for him recently. The line went completely dead for a second. Then he let out a soft chuckle. "Why are you worrying about that?" he asked. "Everything is fine. You always get yourself so worked up over nothing, Sarah." He did not sound defensive. He sounded dismissive, brushing me off with a light tone that made my throat tighten. I tried explaining that I was just doing some year-end budgeting and wanted to get a clear picture of where things stood. He interrupted me gently, telling me not to overthink things and reminding me that we are family. Family. The word fell between us like a heavy weight. It was always the conversation stopper, the ultimate tool used to shut down questions without providing a single real answer. I found myself nodding along, even though he could not see me. I caught myself apologizing, even though I had done nothing wrong. When I hung up, I felt smaller than when I had dialed. I sat there with the phone in my hand, turning the conversation over in my mind. He had not raised his voice, and he had not openly lied, but he had completely avoided the question. Somehow I was the one left feeling guilty for even asking. That realization stung worse than an open argument. It showed me how easily my valid questions were dismissed as overthinking, and how my reasonable need for financial clarity was treated as unnecessary drama. Over the next few days, I started noticing details I used to overlook. My dad spoke about money with an easy confidence that felt completely out of place. He mentioned remodeling plans, home upgrades, and high-ticket purchases that made my stomach drop. Chloe spoke excitedly about the future, describing possibilities completely detached from real financial limits. Nobody talked about a budget. Nobody set spending caps, and nobody ever consulted me. I stayed quiet, watching and listening. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid and reading too much into casual chatter, but the unease kept growing underneath everything I did. Every time my phone buzzed, my shoulders tensed, braced for another request disguised as casual conversation. One afternoon, after another grueling shift, I sat in my car staring at the steering wheel, too drained to press the gas pedal. I thought about how many times I had derailed my own life plans for someone else's needs. I remembered how many times I had promised myself that I would rest later. That later never came. I could not help but wonder, what happens the next time they stumble and I do not reach out to catch them? The answer troubled me, not because of what might happen to them, but because of what it revealed about my actual standing in that family. I had become the default solution to every problem, but I was denied any right to see the full picture. I was loaded with responsibility without being granted any transparency. I was the pillar everyone leaned on, but never a partner at the table. When I got home that night, I opened the laptop again. I did not add up the figures this time. I just looked at them, letting the reality sit there without excuses. Reviewing the statements had not made me furious. It had simply made me aware. Awareness brought a quiet, enduring kind of ache that settled deep into my bones. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the city noise outside in Wicker Park. Miles away in Naperville, my sister was fast asleep, dreaming of endless possibilities, while my dad made future plans without having to worry about where the money would come from. Here I was, finally seeing the reality of the role I had been playing all along. I was not ready to act yet. I was not ready to break the pattern, or start a direct confrontation. But something irreversible had shifted inside me, like a door pushed open that could never be fully closed again. Reviewing those records gave me a clear perspective, and for the first time, I began placing real value on my own well-being. I could no longer pretend I had not seen it. The sacrifices I made were invisible, not because they were small, but because they were taken for granted. Sitting there under the weight of that realization, I knew with complete certainty that things could never go back to the way they were before. Christmas had always been the one time of year I allowed myself to believe that things might balance out. No matter how exhausted I felt, or how thin my life was stretched, I held on to that small hope like a promise to myself. Christmas meant going home, sitting around the same dinner table, sharing the same familiar jokes, and pretending that for just a few days, everyone was on equal footing. As I packed my bag in my apartment and checked my packed work schedule one last time, I kept telling myself that this year would feel different, that maybe all the effort would finally feel worth it. The drive was long and familiar, with Interstate 90 stretching out under a pale winter sky. Classic holiday songs played softly on the radio, and I found myself humming along, even with the tightness lingering in my chest. My thoughts kept drifting back to my dad's message about a massive surprise. I tried my best to push away the image of that red sports car from social media, refusing to let it take root as an assumption. I told myself not to jump ahead of reality, knowing how often overthinking had led to regret in the past. When I pulled my old Civic into the wide suburban driveway in Naperville, the two-story house looked just like it always did. Warm lights glowed from the front windows, and reindeer decorations lined the roof. For a moment, with the engine idling, I felt a familiar sense of relief. This was home, and standing before such a familiar scene made my private doubts feel small. I grabbed my bag, took a breath of cold air, and walked inside. The first thing I heard was the noise. The house was filled with laughter, louder and more lively than I expected. My dad came over and gave me a quick hug, though his attention seemed somewhere else. A second later, Chloe appeared, glowing with an intense energy that I had not seen from her in a long time. I told myself it was just holidays excitement, but my stomach tightened nonetheless. Nobody asked how the drive was on the icy roads, or if I was tired from working back-to-back shifts. The conversation moved around me without ever really including me. I followed them into the kitchen, put down my bag, and automatically slipped into my familiar role as the helper. I started unpacking groceries and helping with dinner prep, doing what I always did without thinking. As the afternoon went on, odd details started standing out. My dad kept glancing down at his phone with a knowing smile. Chloe seemed unusually quiet, looking away whenever I made eye contact, only to burst into loud laughter a moment later. There was a clear sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for an event to begin, and I was the only one left out of the loop. I smiled when they smiled and nodded when they spoke, but that uneasy feeling hummed steadily in the background. At one point, my dad clapped his hands together, declaring that this Christmas was going to be truly unforgettable. When he said it, his eyes were locked entirely on Chloe, without a single glance in my direction. I felt a familiar sting, but pushed it down with old habits, telling myself I was just being overly sensitive after spending too much time alone. Dinner was lively. I moved quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, setting plates, pouring wine, and handling the small tasks that kept everything running smoothly. No one had to ask me to do it. It was simply the role I had occupied for years. Around the table, stories and jokes bounced back and forth. I listened with a polite smile, chiming in occasionally, but my words seemed to dissolve into the air without anyone noticing. My dad casually mentioned how hard I worked, phrasing it as a compliment that felt entirely hollow underneath. "Sarah is just built for this kind of pace," he remarked, as if that explained everything. "You are practical, You do not need anything flashy." A gentle laugh went around the table, and I smiled along, but something inside me shrank. It was not the first time I had heard that sentiment, but it was the first time I fully recognized the dismissive weight behind it. After dinner, we moved to the living room. A large tree glowed in the corner, with neatly wrapped gifts stacked underneath. Porch. I sat on the sofa with my hands folded, watching Chloe pace around, barely able to contain her excitement. I felt like an outside observer, waiting for a cue on how I was expected to react. Part of me still hoped the surprise my dad mentioned was something harmless, a simple gesture that would be easy to smile about. Porch. For a brief moment, the living room felt genuinely peaceful, filled with the scent of pine, warm food, and the fireplace. I leaned back and tried to convince myself that this was what family was supposed to feel like, hoping that being together would dissolve my quiet grievances. Then, I noticed the key fob. Porch. It was sitting right in the center of the walnut coffee table, set slightly apart from everything else. It was not a house key or an ordinary car remote. It was sleek, high-end, and clearly premium, featuring a prominent prancing horse emblem. My eyes kept drifting toward it, I held by a quiet sense of dread. I saw my dad glance at the key, then trade a knowing look with Chloe. "What is that?" "Porch," I asked lightly, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. Chloe laughed a little too quickly. "Oh, nothing," she said. "Just something Dad has been working on." My dad cleared his throat and abruptly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward dessert and coffee. But the key remained right there on the table, silent and unmistakable. "Porch." I told myself to let it go, remembering how often asking direct questions had ruined otherwise pleasant moments. I focused on the tree and the warm lighting, reminding myself that the holidays were about spending time together, not material items. Later that night, after everyone said goodnight, I went upstairs to the guest room. I lay in bed listening to the house settle down. Porch. Faint laughter and hushed voices drifted up from downstairs, sounding relaxed and celebratory. I felt completely detached, as if I were listening to someone else's life through a wall. I thought about the past year, the endless shifts, the stress of balancing every bill, and the tens of thousands of dollars I had sent without hesitation. Porch. I realized how much I had hoped this visit would prove that my presence mattered to them. I rolled over, pulled the blanket close, and felt a heavy pressure in my chest. Sometime in the middle of the night, a distinct sound woke me instantly. It was a low, mechanical hum, coming from a distance but impossible to mistake. The garage door motor running. Porch. My heart rate jumped as the sound echoed through the quiet house. I told myself someone was probably just grabbing something from the garage or stepping outside for fresh air. Still, an unsettling premonition took hold, warning me that a breaking point was near. I lay back down and stared into the dark, my mind racing. Porch. Tomorrow was Christmas morning, and whatever was waiting downstairs would finally be out in the open. I wanted so badly to believe it was harmless, hoping that all my private suspicions were wrong. I repeated that hope like a quiet prayer, even as doubt tightened around me. As the house fell silent again, I realized how stubbornly I had clung to the idea of fairness. Porch. My endurance had come from the belief that patience would eventually bring balance. I did not know it then, but I was standing right at the edge of that illusion. What was about to happen would show me just how unrealistic that belief had been. All I knew was that the feeling keeping me awake was no longer anticipation. It was a heavy, suffocating dread. Porch. Even then, in the dark, I made one last effort to convince myself that whatever was waiting downstairs could not possibly be as thoughtless as I feared. When the hum of the garage door broke through the silence of the house, I was wide awake in an instant. Before my mind could even process the noise, my pulse was already racing. Porch. I sat up straight in bed, the blanket slipping from my shoulders, listening closely as the mechanical motor gradually faded into silence. For a second, I told myself to lie back down. It was not Christmas morning yet, and whatever was happening could easily wait until daylight. My instincts told me otherwise. I stepped out of bed quietly, turning the doorknob slowly to avoid making any sound. Porch. The hallway was dimly lit, with only a small nightlight glowing near the top of the stairs. The hardwood floor felt freezing under my bare feet, and every step forward felt heavier than the last. I was not angry yet. My body was simply bracing for impact, like the seconds before a collision when you know the hit is coming, but cannot predict where the damage will land. Porch. Reaching the top of the landing, a bright light poured up from the lower level. The garage door was fully raised, and the overhead fluorescent lights were glaring. I froze, gripping the handrail tightly, my breath turning shallow. I moved down the stairs, one careful step after another, until the entire scene came into view. Porch. The Ferrari sat right in the center of the garage, looking completely out of place in an ordinary suburban setting. Its bright red finish reflected the harsh overhead lights with a flawless shine, looking like a vehicle lifted straight from a showroom floor. For an instant, my brain stalled, trying to search for any explanation that could make sense of what I was looking at. Porch. Chloe was standing right beside the vehicle with her arms crossed, completely glowing with open excitement, making no effort to hide her delight. My dad stood there too, with one hand resting proudly on the hood, smiling with a level of genuine happiness I had not seen on him in years. They were talking in low tones and laughing together, completely wrapped up in their own private celebration. Porch. It felt like the ground beneath my feet was giving way. Neither of them noticed me at first. I stood frozen on the third step from the bottom, watching the entire scene play out in front of me. There was no gift wrapping, no oversized bow, and no festive display. This was not a surprise being saved for the morning. The celebration had already happened. Porch. I was simply walking in late on an event funded entirely by my own labor. Chloe laughed, a light and effortless sound that felt jarring to hear. She ran her fingers across the sleek side mirror with total admiration. "I still cannot believe this," she said, shaking her head. "It is absolutely perfect." My dad chuckled with unmistakable pride. "You deserve something truly special, honey," he replied. Porch. That statement landed with a heavy, hollow thud in my chest. I took the final steps down, and my presence finally caught their attention. My dad looked up, surprised for a moment, before instantly switching to an easygoing smile. "You are up early, Sarah," he said casually. Chloe turned toward me. Porch. Her expression stiffened for a fraction of a second before quickly smoothing out into a bright, cheerful mask. "Merry Christmas," she called out enthusiastically. "Merry Christmas," I managed to say. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, so many words I wanted to say, but I did not say any of them. I just stood there, with my hands clenched at my sides, looking at the car. Porch. My mind immediately defaulted to what it always did under pressure. Counting the costs. The rent in Wicker Park, the car insurance, Chloe's student loan payments, the urgent bank transfers, the endless late-night shifts at the diner, and the 16-hour weekend doubles. All those memories aligned effortlessly, adding up to a staggering financial total. Porch. I no longer needed to ask where the down payment or the lease funds came from. Every aching muscle in my body already had the answer. Isn't it incredible? Chloe stepped closer, her eyes wide with excitement. Dad gave me the biggest surprise. That was how easily she framed the situation, as if calling it a surprise erased the real cost behind it. Porch. My dad nodded along, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. "I wanted to do something big this year," he said, "something unforgettable." He looked at me, then back at Chloe. She has been through a lot of uncertainty lately, and she really needed this. I stood there and waited. Porch. I was not sure what I was waiting for, perhaps an awkward pause, a hesitant look, or any small sign that acknowledged my perspective. Nothing came. Nobody asked how I felt. Nobody noticed how pale I had turned, or how rigid my posture was. I was treated like an old piece of furniture sitting in the corner, barely caught on the edge of the frame. A moment later, footsteps came down the stairs. Porch. A visiting relative, woken by the commotion in the garage, appeared in the doorway rubbing their eyes. The relative took in the scene with wide eyes, letting out a low whistle of disbelief. "That is unbelievable," they said with a laugh before glancing over at me with a light chuckle. "Sarah, must be nice having a sister like you around." Porch. Right then, something fundamental gave way inside me, quietly and permanently. I managed to hold a polite smile, the same practiced expression I used at work to get through difficult moments without reacting. Chloe stepped forward and gave our dad a tight hug, resting her head on his shoulder. It looked like an ideal holiday moment of family generosity and celebration. Porch. I stood on the outside of that picture, separated by an invisible boundary, watching others enjoy the results of my exhaustion. They started discussing practical details like insurance coverage, maintenance plans, and where she planned to park it. The words washed over me like background noise while a steady ringing filled my ears. Porch. Every sentence confirmed what was already clear. This was not an impulsive purchase. It was a calculated, planned decision made while keeping me entirely in the dark. I began stepping backward quietly, moving out of the garage and into the crisp morning air. The sudden drop in temperature made me shiver. I crossed my arms, watching my breath drift over the light dusting of snow on the driveway. The sky was an overcast gray, and the neighborhood was completely still, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. After standing outside for a moment, I walked back toward the car. I needed to touch it once, just to prove to myself that it was real and not a product of burnout. My fingers brushed against the cold metal door, the smooth finish feeling completely indifferent. It was just an object, but it carried the weight of every sacrifice I had made, and every personal boundary I had let slide. Standing there, the initial shock settled into a clear, steady awareness. This was not a misunderstanding. It was the predictable outcome of a long-standing pattern where my contributions were treated as standard resources. I had funded access to a lifestyle I was never meant to share. I turned around, walked back inside, and climbed the stairs to the guest room. The house felt completely different now, distant and uncomfortable. I shut the door and leaned my back against it until my legs gave out, sliding down to sit on the floor in the dim room, my pulse still pounding. I did not cry. I felt a strange numbness, suspended in a space where emotion had not yet caught up. My mind replayed the past years, searching for any moment where someone might have recognized how unbalanced things had become, but found none. What hurt the most was not the money, or even the car itself. It was how comfortable they were leaving me out of the equation, and how naturally my support had been expected, and then rendered invisible. I remembered every time I had said I could handle things, and every compliment about being self-reliant and undemanding. Sitting on the floor in the quiet dawn, the true cost of being the dependable child was completely clear. Faint, cheerful laughter drifted up from downstairs as the celebration continued. I moved over to the bed and lay flat, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the steady rise and fall of my breathing. In a house full of people, the sense of isolation was absolute. The car did not just show where the money went. It clarified my exact role in the household. I was not seen as someone who needed consideration or care. I was simply a resource, valued only for what I could provide. As daylight broke through the gray sky, the sharp sting began to give way to a cold, steady calm. A line had been crossed, and there was no way to return to the illusions of the past. I did not have a complete plan figured out yet. Lying there while the morning continued downstairs without me, one reality remained undeniable. I could never unsee what had been made so clear today. For the first time in my life, a voice deep inside me told me with absolute certainty, I was done pretending. I stayed in my room much longer than I should have, lying perfectly still, as if that could stop the morning from moving forward without me. Downstairs, the house was alive with the mundane hum of life, the hiss of the Keurig, the soft click of cupboard doors, and the carefree laughter that drifted up the stairs. No one came up to check on me. No knock, no gentle inquiry to see if I was okay. The family celebration didn't hit pause for my heartbreak, and that realization hit harder than the initial shock. Eventually, I forced myself up. Porch. I splashed water on my face and stared at the woman in the mirror, barely recognizing her. My eyes were dull, rimmed with dark circles that went beyond sleep deprivation. It was the look of a soul stretched past its limit. I told myself I needed water, fresh air, anything but staying locked in that room. Porch. I turned the knob and stepped back into the hallway, moving with guarded, deliberate steps toward the stairs. The voices below grew clearer. My dad and Chloe were in the kitchen, their tones casual and completely unguarded. They had no idea I was right there. I slowed my pace unintentionally, stopping at the final step before the landing, my hand brushing the wall. Porch. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I just happened to be there. At least she likes the car, my dad was saying, his voice filled with that warm, satisfied tone of someone whose plans had succeeded. That's all that matters. Chloe let out a soft laugh. I do, she said. It's still so crazy, Dad. I feel like I'm dreaming. Porch. There was a brief silence in the kitchen, and then Chloe added, in a casual afterthought tone. Do you think she noticed? My stomach dropped. My dad sighed. There was no weight in it, no guilt. Just a familiar, weary annoyance. She wouldn't understand, he said. You know how she is. She always overthinks everything and makes things complicated. Porch. That sentence, with its quiet finality, sucked the remaining air out of my lungs. Chloe didn't argue, she just gave a hum of agreement. Yeah, she said. She's always so intense like that. There was no malice in her voice, no hesitation, just a cold, absolute certainty. Porch. They moved on immediately, their conversation shifting smoothly to daily chores. What to have for breakfast where Chloe planned to travel next month. The dialogue flowed naturally, unbothered by the mention of me. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so loudly, I was certain they could hear it. She wouldn't understand. In that moment, a fundamental belief within me was cut clean in two. Porch. For years, I had held on to the belief that if I just explained myself better, if I were more patient, or if I found the right words, they would eventually understand me. Every time my feelings were dismissed, I blamed myself, convinced that I wasn't being clear enough, that I was too emotional, or that I had missed the point. Porch. Hearing my dad say that so casually stripped away that final layer of self-deception. The truth wasn't that I wouldn't understand. The truth was that to them I wasn't worth an explanation. I backed away slowly, step by step with agonizing care. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. Not yet. Porch. I retreated upstairs, shut the door, and leaned against the wood, my chest heaving with short, sharp breaths. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't from shock. It was from something cold and razor-sharp forming inside me. The Ferrari wasn't the real betrayal. It was just a physical object that made the betrayal tangible. Porch. This casual, unguarded kitchen chat was the final truth I had been running from for years. They never saw me as a daughter. In their eyes, I was a functional NPC, a machine for funding, an outsourced problem solver, a sponge designed to absorb their anxiety so they could rest easy. My feelings were not part of the family formula. My understanding didn't need to be considered. Porch. My role was purely output, never questioning. I looked in the mirror again. Truly, honestly, looked. I saw the Sarah who always showed up without complaint, the Sarah who hid her exhaustion behind a smile, the Sarah who sent money on time and never asked for anything in return, the Sarah who cheered from the sidelines while paying for the whole game. Porch. I realized how many times I had said, I understand over the years. I said it when I was falling apart, when I was deeply hurt, and when I was completely ignored. I used those words to keep the peace, to prove my maturity, to reassure them I wasn't being selfish. I understand had been my shield. Now, I saw the price of holding that shield for so long. My understanding never protected me. Porch. It only erased me. I sat on the edge of the bed, pressing my palms into the mattress to find an anchor. I expected rage, but there was none. Instead, there was a strange, eerie calm. the kind of silence that follows a brutal truth finally clicking into place. I wasn't angry, I was just tired of lying to myself. I replayed the last decade with a new, cruel clarity. How family decisions were made without my input. How my money evaporated without explanation. How my valid concerns were labeled as overreacting. This wasn't negligence. This was a system. They had built a perfect machine of exploitation, where my sacrifices were not only invisible but expected. And through my compliance, I had helped pour the concrete for the foundation. Downstairs, the Christmas morning went on. Doors opened and closed. Plates clattered. The Ferrari sat in the garage, collecting excitement. I imagined Chloe dreaming of where to drive it, and my dad nodding proudly by her side. I imagined them living comfortably in a perfect world I had fully funded but was never invited to enter. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts slow and measured. I wasn't spiraling in emotion anymore. For the first time, I was truly seeing. I allowed myself to think a thought I had always instinctively pushed away. What if doing more is never enough? What if the problem isn't that I don't give enough, but that constantly giving is the only way they measure my worth? The realization hurt, but it brought an unexpected relief. If my value in this family was tied solely to what I could provide, then the acceptance I had been chasing was never intended for me as a person anyway. No amount of explaining would change that fundamental logic. I considered storming downstairs to tell them I'd heard everything, but the impulse died as quickly as it came. There was no point. They hadn't said anything vile. They had simply spoken their truth, and in that truth, there was no place for me. I unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. The numbers and settings stared back at me. Clean, compliant. Automated transfers, scheduled payments. The mechanical gears that kept my family's polished life running. I scrolled down slowly, my chest rising and falling. No panic, no rush, just a profound clarity about the weight those numbers carried. I remembered every excuse I'd used. They need me. It's just temporary. Families help each other. Those lofty words had carried me through countless nights of exhaustion, but they were the same words that had kept me trapped. My finger hovered over an upcoming scheduled transfer. My heart beat quickly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. This wasn't for punishment or revenge. It was to return to the truth. I pressed Cancel Series. The screen refreshed. The entry was gone. Nothing exploded. The house didn't shake. The world didn't end. I sat there staring at the screen, waiting for some horrible consequence to strike. But there was nothing. Instead, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. Not joy, not relief, but a vast spatial sense. The silence left behind once the heavy obligation had been removed. I set the phone down and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Minute later, footsteps sounded on the stairs. My dad walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, still in that sluggish, post-sleep haze. He smiled easily when he saw me. "Up early, Sarah," he said, reaching for a coffee filter in his typical, relaxed way. The absurdity of the moment almost made me laugh. For a split second, I wondered if I should keep the secret, let the change take effect quietly, and buy myself a few more days of fake peace. But boundaries aren't built that way. I was done hiding. "Can we talk later?" I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. He stopped, looked at me with slight confusion, and nodded. "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. And this time I meant it. The conversation happened in the afternoon, when the house was quieter. Chloe was gone, likely off showing off the car. My dad and I sat across from each other in the living room. The decorations were still up, the lights twinkling. The scene felt surreal, as if the physical world hadn't caught up to the upheaval inside me. He started with his paternal script, asking about my job in Chicago. I gave short, direct answers, offering nothing extra. When a natural pause arrived, I went straight to the point. "I won't be sending any more money home," I said. The words hung in the air, simple and bare. He frowned, not fully grasping the meaning at first. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Is something wrong? Are you overdrawn?" Porch. No, I said, meeting his eyes. Nothing is wrong. I can't do it anymore. His expression shifted from confusion to a heavy, pressurized concern. But Sarah, you know how much we rely on that, he said, adopting a rational tone. You know how tight things are right now. I nodded. I know. Here it was. Porch. The familiar trap. The moment I used to jump into to apologize, explain, and promise a solution. But this time, I stayed silent, letting the heavy, dead air stretch between us. He sighed. Sarah, we're family. He leaned back into the leather couch, using his tone of paternal authority. Family is about helping each other. That's how the world works. I had expected those words. Porch. But as they hit me, they no longer triggered the immediate guilt of the past. I can still love you, Dad, I said slowly and carefully. But I cannot continue to support someone else's life at the expense of my own. He stared at me, visibly rattled. After everything we've done for you? He countered. Porch. It wasn't an angry accusation. It was stated as a fundamental truth that should have explained everything. I felt the old instinct to jump up, defend myself, and list every sacrifice I had made over the years. I took a deep breath, let the feeling pass through me, and stayed still. I'm not saying you haven't done things for me, I said calmly. Porch. I'm saying this financial model is not sustainable for me anymore. He shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. You're being dramatic, Sarah. It's just money. We'll figure it out. In that second, the realization was agonizing. For him, it really was just money. For me, it was years of my youth and a life fully depleted. I already figured it out, I said quietly. Porch. The conversation didn't explode. There was no screaming, no tears. Just a silence that expanded until my dad seemed to realize that a fundamental rule had been broken. He tried a few more times to return to his usual vocabulary. Family, duty, consideration. Each time I listened quietly, let him finish, and repeated my boundary without emotion. No explanations, no apologies. Porch. Finally, he went silent. The disappointment in his eyes was naked, but beneath it was a deep confusion. Because now that I was no longer playing the ATM, he didn't have a clue how to interact with me. When it was clear we had reached a wall, I stood up. I'm going upstairs to pack, I said. I'm heading back to Chicago early. That finally sparked a reaction. Porch. You're leaving? He raised his voice. Over this? I stopped and looked at him. No, I said, because of all of this. Upstairs, I began stuffing my things into my bag. No frenzy, no anger, just a mechanical sense of order. Every sweater and every book I packed felt like reclaiming a small piece of territory that was mine alone and owed to no one. Porch. The house was terribly quiet, filled with the weight of unspoken resentment. I was halfway through when Chloe came back. She leaned against the doorframe, her exuberance gone, replaced by a cold, sharp bitterness. You're really doing this? She asked coldly. I met her gaze. Yes. She let out a dismissive scoff. You're overreacting, Sarah. You're always making things so dramatic. Porch. I felt a sudden, intense sadness. Not for me, but for the depth of the lie she was living. Maybe, I said. But this is what I need. She rolled her eyes and turned away without another word. No apology, no curiosity about why I was hitting a breaking point. Just total disdain. And for some reason, the disdain hurt far less than it used to. Porch. As I zipped my bag, this expensive suburban villa no longer felt like home. It felt like a costume I had outgrown. I walked to the door, paused, and looked back at the room. Not with nostalgia, but with a cruel, steady clarity. I wasn't leaving because I hated them. I was leaving because staying any longer would be an act of self-erasure. Porch. I carried my bag down the stairs, passing them without interference. My dad stood by the kitchen island, staring at the marble. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. I opened the front door, and the bitter Chicago wind roared to greet me. I stood on the porch and breathed in the cold. The heavy stone I'd carried for years felt different now. Porch. In some ways it was heavier, but in others it had vanished entirely. Building boundaries has a price, and I was paying that bill in full. But as I reached for my keys and walked toward my old Civic, I realized with absolute certainty. I hadn't lost their unconditional support. I had only lost the illusion that it had ever been unconditional to begin with. Porch. And for the first time, the shattering of that illusion tasted like freedom. My first night back in my own apartment was quieter than I expected. It was the kind of silence you aren't in a rush to fill. I sat on the edge of the bed with my suitcase half open on the floor. I rarely spent a full day in this Wicker Park place I'd been renting for months. Porch. The air smelled of cheap cleaner and the distinct scent of a fresh start. Outside, the hum of the L train and the traffic provided a steady, indifferent reminder that life was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I didn't cry that night, which surprised me. I had expected the breaking point to bring tears, shaking hands, and overwhelming regret the moment the door closed behind me. Porch. Instead, there was just a heavy calm, like the exhaustion left behind after a long, grueling fever finally breaks. I lay back on the mattress, watching the ceiling, listening to the simple rhythm of my own breath. For the first time in years, no one else's crisis was pressing down on my chest like a rock, and no upcoming emergency was ticking down on tomorrow's calendar. Porch. Over the next few days, life began to unfold in slow motion, as if a body that had been overworked for years was relearning how to walk. I went to my logistics job, clocked in, and answered emails. My coworkers noticed something different. "Sarah, you look tired," they said with typical American earnestness. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Yeah, I'm doing great." In a bizarre way, it was the truth. Porch. I was drained, but this exhaustion was honest. It was spent on myself, not drawn out to fill someone else's black hole. For the first few nights, my phone was as quiet as a brick. Then, the messages started flooding in. At first, they were subtle and probing. A missed call from my dad, a short iMessage asking if I'd made it to the city safely. I didn't reply right away. Porch. It wasn't spite or revenge. I just needed time to sit with my own emotions rather than reflexively absorbing theirs. When I finally replied, I kept it brief. "I'm fine, I need some space." The next text was from Chloe, not out of concern, but with a sharp point. "So you're really doing this?" she wrote. "Over money?" Porch. I stared at the screen, feeling the old defensive reflex, the urge to explain myself until I was empty. I typed out a long, heart-wrenching response, then deleted it. Typed, deleted. Finally, I sent one short sentence. "It's not about the money." She didn't reply. As the second week passed, the tone of their messages changed. Porch. The concern turned into naked frustration, which quickly curdled into guilt-tripping. They kept telling me how tight things were at home, and reminding me that I was the only pillar they could rely on. Every message was wrapped in that duty odor I could smell a mile away. And for the first time in my life, I didn't fall apart under the pressure. Porch. I began noticing the small things I'd had no time for before. Like waking up without leaden shoulders, finishing a cup of coffee at the window bar without feeling chased by time. The silence not triggering a panic that I needed to do something to be valuable. One evening after my diner shift, I walked into a local Trader Joe's. I walked the aisles slowly, pushing my cart. Porch. My only criterion for food became, what do I want to eat? Not what's on sale, or can this last 3 days so I can save money to send home? Standing in the frozen section with a slightly overpriced box of pasta, I couldn't stop myself from smiling. It was such a small thing, yet it felt monumental. Back home, I made a hot dinner and played a Spotify playlist. Porch. Sitting at my island eating, I didn't feel lonely. A quiet, shy realization bloomed. This is what life feels like when I don't have to be ready to absorb everyone else's crisis. Guilt still knocks, usually late at night. It asks with that familiar, stinging voice. Are they okay without you? Are you being selfish? Are you abandoning your family? I don't try to suppress those thoughts anymore. Porch. I let them rise and then fade. I watch them like a bystander rather than obeying them like a slave. I finally understand. Guilt isn't proof that I've done something wrong. It's proof that I'm changing. A week after I left, my dad called again. I picked up. He sounded worn out, stripped of his usual authoritative veneer. Porch. He asked a few awkward questions about my life, then cut straight to his core purpose. Bills, repairs, pressure. I listened quietly, not interrupting, even though my chest tightened and the instinct to reach for my credit card flared. When he finished, a heavy, expectant silence hung on the line. "I can't help you," I said calmly. Dead silence. "Are you serious?" he finally asked. Arch. His tone was absurdly incredulous, as if he'd been sure I was just acting out and would back down as soon as he applied pressure. "You're putting us in a difficult position," he said sharply. I closed my eyes and took a breath, rooting my feet into the floor. "Dad, I've been in a difficult position for a long, long time," I replied. "I'm not doing it anymore." Arch. He didn't argue, and he didn't apologize. A few seconds later, he hung up politely but coldly. As the dial tone buzzed, I felt a familiar pang of disappointment, but the pain was softer now, buffered by a sobering truth. They weren't angry because they missed me. They were angry because their ATM had finally shut down. In the weeks that followed, my life began to fill up in a new way. Torch. I signed up for a pottery class in Lincoln Park. Something I'd wanted for years but never had the time or money for. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from, surprised by how easily my laughter returned. I started running by Lake Michigan in the morning, feeling the chill air and the strength returning to my body. Torch. Every small act of self-care felt like stitching the broken pieces of myself back together. One afternoon, while walking home, a red sports car stopped at a crosswalk. For a split second, my chest tightened. Then, the light turned green, the engine roared, and the car disappeared into Chicago traffic. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing steadily, waiting for the familiar surge of rage or grief. Torch. It didn't come. The Ferrari had lost its power over me. Yes, it remained a symbol, but it was no longer the remote control for my emotions. It was just a signpost, reminding me of the boundary I'd drawn and would never cross again. The injustice of it hadn't been erased, but it no longer defined my life. In those quiet days, I began to understand a deeper truth. Healing isn't a grand gesture. Torch. It isn't Hollywood dramatic. It happens in the quiet choices made day after day. Choosing not to explain yourself endlessly, choosing not to be the savior, choosing to put rest before duty. One night, I dimmed the lights and sat on my couch, realizing I hadn't obsessively checked my bank balance in days. Torch. I didn't have to calculate my survival, and I didn't have to prepare for the next surprise transfer request. My own money sat quietly in my account, stable and unclaimed. For the first time, my future felt like something I was actually allowed to plan for myself. This didn't mean I stopped loving my family. Love doesn't evaporate just because you set a boundary. But it changed shape. Torch. It became something that didn't require me to erase myself to prove its existence. There would be hard moments. Thanksgivings and Christmases would be completely different, and phone calls would remain brief and polite. The illusion of a perfect family I'd held onto so tightly had finally turned to ash. I gave myself permission to mourn that loss without trying to force replace it. Torch. Loss, too, deserves room to breathe. As the calendar turned, I felt like a new person. Or rather, a person I'd hidden for too long was finally coming home. A woman who knew her limits. A woman who understood that being needed is not being loved. A woman who could stand alone without breaking. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone lit up with a short iMessage from Chloe. Torch. Dad is furious. He says you've changed. I stared at the words for a moment, then typed back, I hope so. I set the phone down, killed the bedside lamp, and curled up in the warm duvet. Outside, the city pulsed, vast, alive, and utterly indifferent. Inside me, a quiet, absolute certainty had settled into my marrow. This is the price you pay for choosing to be yourself. Torch. And for the first time in my life, I felt the bill was worth every cent. When I finally agreed to meet them, I set strict ground rules. It had to be at a neutral Panera Bread, right halfway between my apartment and their place in the suburbs. Absolute public space, absolute neutral ground. I arrived early and took a booth near the window. Torch. Watching the Chicago crowd rush past outside helped anchor me to reality. I kept reminding myself why I was sitting there. Not to apologize, not to fix the broken relationship, but simply to be honest. They walked in together. My father looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched, his expression extremely tense. Orch. Chloe was a step behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes filled with heavy defensiveness. We exchanged brief, cold greetings and sat down. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, packed with all the unspoken conflict waiting to explode. For the first few minutes, we made absurd small talk about the terrible Illinois weather, work, and the traffic on I-290. Orch. It felt like a bad play where everyone had memorized their lines. Finally, my father cleared his throat loudly and leaned forward. "This has gone far enough, Sarah," he said, setting the tone. I didn't even blink. "What has gone far enough?" "This estrangement," he answered sharply. "This Cold War and all the tension. You're making things very difficult." There it was. Orch. "No, how are you doing? No, I'm sorry for hurting you." In his world, my boundary was just an inconvenience. "I didn't start a Cold War," I said calmly. "I just stopped pretending nothing happened." Chloe scoffed bitterly and rolled her eyes. "You always do this. You take everything so personally." I turned to look at her, really seeing her without any filters. Orch. For the first time in my life, I had zero urge to defend myself or prove how much pain I was in. "It was personal," I said, looking her in the eye, "because it was my money, my time, and my life being drained." My father let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples forcefully. "We never asked you to feel this way," he rationalized. "Right." I hit back instantly. "Orch, you just enjoyed the benefits of me carrying all that weight." A dead silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. My father shifted uncomfortably, his frustration boiling over. "Family is supposed to help each other," he said, throwing out that familiar line as if repeating it enough times would give it magic power. "It's what you're supposed to do." And I did. I held my ground. Orch. For years I helped until there was nothing left of me. Chloe leaned in, her voice turning sharp and harsh. "So what? You think you're better than us now?" The old Sarah would have panicked hearing that. She would have tried to comfort her, putting herself down to prove she didn't mean it that way. But the new me just took a deep breath. "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "Orch. I just think I'm allowed to live too." That was the moment the masks completely shattered. My father's tone turned cold as iron. "You're being selfish, Sarah." There it was. The word that had haunted me for most of my life. The ultimate accusation designed to keep me in line as their personal cash machine. I felt that word try to pierce my chest like a blade, searching for a weak spot to take root. Orch. But it failed. "Maybe," I replied, calm and distant. "But I'm done being selfless if it means destroying myself to make everyone else happy." Chloe shoved her chair back and crossed her arms tighter. "You know how hard things are for us financially right now," she said through gritted teeth. "And you just don't give a damn anymore, do you?" I met her bitter look directly. "I care. Orch. I'm just not going to ruin my life to fix yours anymore." After that, the conversation completely spiraled. They started listing everything they had ever done for me. Every sacrifice, every childhood expense, every moment of support. I listened quietly, without interrupting a single word, letting them vent all their anger. When they finally paused for air, I nodded slowly. "I appreciate it," I said. "Orch. But appreciation isn't a life sentence of obligation." That line hit a nerve. For a long, painful minute, neither of them said a word. Finally, my father looked at me, and the unshakable certainty in his eyes flickered with a rare moment of doubt. "So, what do you actually want?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. Orch. Not because it was unreasonable, but because it was the first time in my life anyone had asked what I wanted. "I want a relationship where I'm not just seen as a bank account," I said, word by word. "I want total financial transparency. I want firm boundaries. And if that's impossible, then I want distance." Chloe let out a bitter, sharp laugh. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Orch. "Yes," I said, looking at both of them. "I'm completely serious." The waiter brought the bill soon after. The conversation had exhausted everyone, stripping away all pretense and leaving only the harsh truth. My father pulled out a card and paid, a small gesture that felt strangely like a final closing chapter. When we stood up to leave, an awkward pause hung in the air. Porch, the kind where everyone knows something has permanently died, but no one knows how to say the final goodbye. I hope you snap out of this soon, Sarah, my father said quietly. I nodded. I already did. Stepping out through the glass doors of Panera Bread, the cold Chicago wind cut sharply across my face, but it gave me an unprecedented sense of clarity. Porch. I stood on the sidewalk, watching them walk toward the parking lot. They leaned into each other, a tight unit protecting their own interests, and I had been completely written out of the equation. A familiar ache tightened in my chest. But it wasn't regret. It was grief. I was mourning the family I wished had protected and loved me, not grieving the real one that had taken advantage of me. Porch. That evening, back in my apartment, I turned off all the lights and let the vibrant Chicago neon flow through the blinds. Sitting alone on the couch, I allowed myself to feel everything. Deep sadness, quiet anger, and an overwhelming sense of relief. Healing is never a straight line, and I didn't expect it to be. But something core inside me had shifted forever. Porch. I would no longer lie awake at night wondering if I overreacted. I would no longer replay conversations in my head, looking for ways to soften my stance just to keep the peace. I spoke my truth without backing down. And that mattered a million times more than how they reacted. Over the next few months, contact dropped to almost zero. My birthday passed quietly. Porch. The holidays were small and quiet, but incredibly light. I filled the empty space with my own friends, my own schedule, and a clear vision for my future. I started saving money for things I actually cared about, instead of pouring funds into a bottomless pit that wasn't mine to fill. One evening, while reviewing my budget at my computer, something hit me that made me stop in my tracks. Porch. For the first time in my adult life, my future felt completely safe and stable. Not because I was straining to carry my whole family forward, but because I finally put the load down. That bright red sports car was now a distant memory. It was no longer a monument of anger or betrayal. It had become a turning point, a milestone that forced me to face a painful reality I had avoided for decades. Porch. I didn't lose my family by setting boundaries. Setting boundaries made me see exactly who they were all along. As tough as that truth was, it gave me something I had never possessed in the first half of my life: complete freedom. The sign that my life had fundamentally changed happened on an ordinary Sunday morning. Porch. In the past, these mornings were filled with dread, a sharp countdown reminding me of all the obligations waiting for me. Instead, I woke up naturally, without an alarm jarring my heart awake. Soft morning light poured over the wooden floor. For the first time, my chest didn't feel weighed down by an immense pressure. Porch. There were no urgent texts on my screen, no financial emergencies hanging over my head, just a quiet, honest peace that I had earned for myself. I stayed in bed for a long time, listening to Wicker Park wake up outside, cars rolling smoothly through the intersection, muted footsteps in the hallway, distant laughter on the street. The world was moving forward without demanding anything from me. Porch. And instead of feeling abandoned, I felt truly part of it for the first time. I got up slowly and brewed a cup of coffee, soaking in the quiet ritual. Holding the warm mug, I looked down at the street below. I remembered how many mornings had started with my mind racing like a cash register, calculating bills, transfers, and promises I never should have made. Porch. The woman who had been drained to the point of invisibility felt so far away now, like an old shell I had completely outgrown. In the weeks following the confrontation at Panera Bread, life wasn't easy, but it was clear. Occasionally, the old guilt would try to creep back in, whispering that family supports each other, or that I had the means to help them. Porch. But each time I looked at those thoughts coldly and let them fade away. I learned a hard lesson. Strength doesn't mean sacrificing yourself until you're completely drained. Strength means knowing when to say enough. I began building a life centered on my own choices. I rearranged the furniture in my apartment just because I wanted to. Porch. I signed up for a weekend painting workshop I had always been curious about. I started saying no to others and yes to myself. Every small choice felt like putting pieces of my true self back together. One afternoon before heading out, I stopped in front of the full-length mirror by the entryway to adjust my coat collar. I paused. Porch. The eyes looking back at me had something unfamiliar in them. Not just happiness, but complete presence. I was fully here, no longer split between managing my own fatigue and meeting everyone else's unfair expectations. I smiled at my reflection, a genuine smile that caught me off guard. I don't hate my family, and accepting that was important for me. Porch. Stepping down from my role as the family provider didn't mean wiping out the love I once had. It just meant accepting reality. Healthy relationships can survive boundaries. Unhealthy ones fall apart. Relationships that collapse the moment you stop giving unconditionally were never built on equal love in the first place. Porch. Memories still hit me out of nowhere sometimes. A song in a store or the flash of a red sports car on the street. That car is still etched in my mind, but it lost its power to hurt me. It isn't a fresh wound anymore. It's a marker showing where my past ended and my future began. I used to measure my worth by how much weight I could carry for others. Now, I measure it by how freely I can breathe. Porch. I slowly came to realize something else. I was no longer invisible because I stopped erasing myself. I had mistaken being needed for being loved. When I finally separated the two, my entire world changed. Real love doesn't demand total exhaustion. It doesn't require silent compliance, and it certainly doesn't punish reasonable boundaries. Porch. Sitting at my desk one evening, going over my financial statements, a quiet sense of pride came over me. Not because of the numbers themselves, but because they belonged entirely to me. My hard work, my effort, and my future. For the first time, I was planning for genuine happiness instead of managing chaos that wasn't mine to solve. Porch. I started thinking about who I wanted to be 10 years down the road. Not the self-sacrificing person trying to keep everyone else afloat, but a woman who confidently chooses herself without offering excuses. Someone who builds relationships on mutual respect, rather than one-sided demands, and who knows her worth without needing validation from anyone else. Was there sadness? Of course. Porch. I won't pretend there wasn't. I grieved the illusion that if I just held on long enough, they would finally see me, appreciate me, and stand up for me. I grieved the years spent believing that if I just worked a little harder, things would be fair. That sadness was real, and it needed space. I gave it that space, but I refused to let it drag me back down. Porch. The most amazing part was that once I stopped waiting for their approval, my heart felt lighter than ever. I didn't need an apology to move forward, nor did I need understanding from people who had already decided not to give it. All I needed was absolute honesty with myself, and I finally had that. Porch. On another quiet morning, walking through a neighborhood park and listening to the dry leaves crunch beneath my feet, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the strain I had endured, but for the brave choices I made in the end. Gratitude for the courage to say no, the strength to walk away, and the quiet life unfolding right in front of me. Porch. I was no longer the daughter sacrificing herself to hold a family together. I was the person who saved herself, and that is more than enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible or pressured to give until you had nothing left, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Porch. Feel free to share your experience in the comments, or let me know which part of this journey spoke to you the most. Your voice matters here. If you found value or strength in this story, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps us continue sharing stories about setting boundaries, knowing your worth, and finding the courage to put yourself first. Porch. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the quietest decisions bring about the biggest transformations.